On what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, a black mother's peaceful drive takes a turn that no one could have predicted. What happens next will leave you speechless. After a simple traffic stop, Officer Reid makes a decision that will change everything. What happens when a racist cop targets a mother on the highway? The shocking consequences you have to see. But before we dive into the full story, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. This story is just getting started. The highway stretched out ahead like a lifeless, endless road, flanked by towering trees and the occasional dilapidated sign. Tasha, a black mother in her mid-30s, gripped the steering wheel of her beat-up car as she navigated the quiet stretch of road. Her son Jaden sat in the back seat, headphones on, lost in his own world. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced on the asphalt. The ride had been peaceful, and Tasha was finally starting to unwind after a week of working 2 shifts as a nurse. The stress of caring for others, dealing with hospital chaos, and being the sole provider for her son was a lot to bear. But today it was just them. Tasha felt the hum of the engine beneath her, the rhythmic motion easing her tension. She had just passed the small town where she grew up and was heading toward the next one for a visit with family. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening, until she saw the flashing lights in the rearview mirror. "Great," she muttered under her breath. She knew what was coming. She wasn't speeding. Her car wasn't flashy, and it wasn't the kind of vehicle that screamed trouble. But she had grown all too familiar with the feeling of being targeted on the road. She pulled over to the shoulder, her heart beating just a little faster. Jaden's voice broke the silence from the back seat. "What's going on, Mom?" "Just a routine stop, baby," Tasha replied, her voice calm, though the underlying anxiety crept in. She didn't want to worry Jaden. He was only 10, but he could sense when something was off. The police officer approached her car, and Tasha immediately recognized the cold authority and demeanor. Officer Reid. She'd seen him patrolling this stretch of highway before, and each time, he gave off a sense of discomfort. He was tall, with a hard, chiseled face that betrayed little emotion. But Tasha had learned to read people like him. The way he walked, his rigid stance, it wasn't friendly, it wasn't professional. Reid tapped on the window with a heavy hand, his knock sharp and deliberate. Tasha rolled it down, keeping her hands firmly on the wheel. "License and registration," Officer Reid said, his voice clipped and demanding. Tasha's mind raced. She hadn't done anything wrong, so why did she feel so uneasy? "I wasn't speeding, officer," she said, trying to keep her voice even. Officer Reid didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, his eyes flicked past her to the back seat, where Jaden sat quietly. "And who's that back there? You think you can just drive through here without being careful?" His tone had a hint of condescension. Tasha clenched her jaw but held her composure. She knew better than to argue at this point. "That's my son," she replied, her voice growing firmer. "We're just on our way to visit family." "Yeah, I see," Officer Reid said, his eyes narrowing. He took a long pause, as if measuring something in his mind. Then he reached for his radio, speaking into it with a tone that suggested something darker was looming. "Running the plates, hold tight." Tasha's stomach twisted. Running the plates? Why was he doing that? Was it normal for a routine stop? She glanced back at Jaden, who still had his headphones on, oblivious to the rising tension. Tasha forced a smile, trying to reassure herself that everything was fine. But deep down she knew. She had been here before. After a few moments, Officer Reid stepped back from the car. His movements were deliberate, almost too deliberate. The silence between them stretched, and Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Suddenly, without warning, Officer Reid yanked open the door and pulled Tasha from her seat with brutal force. "Out of the car now," he barked. Tasha's heart dropped. "What?" "I said get out," Officer Reid repeated, his grip tightening as he forcibly yanked her out of the car. Jaden's confused voice shouted from the back seat. "Mom, what's happening?" Tasha struggled to maintain control, her mind racing. "Jaden, stay in the car, stay in the car," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. But the officer didn't care. He was determined to make a scene, and nothing was going to stop him. Tasha was pushed roughly onto the hot pavement. She could feel the sting of the gravel against her skin as she tried to get her footing, her hands shaking. "I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice cracking with frustration. "You have no right to do this." Officer Reid didn't respond. His eyes were cold, devoid of empathy. He didn't see her as a person, didn't see her as a mother. She was just a target, another opportunity for him to flex his power. Tasha felt herself growing weaker as the pressure of the moment wore on. This wasn't just a traffic stop, it was something much more dangerous. She could feel the injustice of it crawling under her skin. "Get on the ground," Officer Reid ordered. I'm not doing that. She wasn't going to let him have that control over her. But that was the last mistake she made. In one swift motion, Reid drew his gun, aiming it directly at Tasha. Her breath caught in her throat as she froze, the barrel of the gun pointing directly at her chest. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. All she could hear was the beating of her own heart, the rush of adrenaline, and the terrified cry of Jaden from the back seat. "Mom!" Jaden screamed again, his voice full of desperation. The officer didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on her, cold and unforgiving. Before she could react, before she could do anything, Officer Reid's finger pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot split the air, and Tasha's world exploded in pain. She crumpled to the ground, the world blurring around her as her body reacted to the force of the bullet. The world around Tasha spun in chaotic flashes of color. She could hear Jaden's cries, distant and muffled, as though they were coming from a far-off place. Her body felt heavy, unresponsive, the pain shooting through her chest like fire. She tried to move, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It felt as though the air had been sucked out of her lungs, leaving only the crushing weight of terror and confusion. Jaden's voice was a constant, frantic blur, but everything felt distant now, as though she were underwater.
"Mom!"
Jaden's voice broke through the haze, desperate, panicked. Tasha's heart ached as she tried to focus on him, to reassure him, but her body wasn't cooperating. The cold pavement beneath her felt uncomfortably sharp as she struggled to raise herself. Blood pooled beneath her, and the warmth spread like a suffocating blanket, but still the world around her seemed slow, distorted. Her chest burned, and every breath she tried to take was more difficult than the last. Officer Reid stood over her, his eyes cold and distant, as though he were watching some insignificant scene play out. His gun was still drawn, his hand steady, but the world had stopped making sense. "You shouldn't have resisted," he muttered, his voice low but filled with bitterness. "This is your fault." Tasha tried to look up at him, to find the strength to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat, her body betraying her. She heard the sound of tires screeching, and the distant hum of another car approaching. The shrill noise of a police siren echoed through the air, but it was too late. Everything was too late. Her vision blurred, her head spinning. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't leave Jaden alone. She fought to hold on, her hands trembling, but the world continued to spin, and her body grew colder with each passing second. From somewhere behind her, Derek's voice broke through the noise. "What the hell is going on here?" His tone was a mix of disbelief and anger. He had been nearby, and the sounds of the commotion had drawn him in, but what he saw was beyond what he could have imagined. Samantha's protector, Derek, stormed toward the scene, his gaze hard and resolute. He had watched the entire interaction from a distance, his heart sinking when he saw Officer Reid draw his weapon. It was a flash of fear that turned into seething anger, and now he was here, ready to face whatever it took. Officer Reid turned to face him, his gun still raised, but Derek wasn't backing down. The air between them was thick with hostility, but Derek was undeterred. "Put the gun down, Reid, now." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Stay back or I'll make sure you regret it," he warned, his voice low and menacing. His finger still hovered near the trigger, but something about Derek's presence seemed to unsettle him. Derek stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "You just shot a woman in cold blood. You've got no right to be holding that gun. You don't get to take her life. Not today, not ever." Tasha could barely hear the words, but they seemed to have an effect on Officer Reid. His hand shook slightly, and he glanced at her lying on the pavement, blood staining her clothes. But there was no remorse in his eyes, only the cold, hard look of a man who thought he could get away with everything. "I told you to stay back," Officer Reid barked, his finger twitching again as if he were ready to pull the trigger once more. Derek didn't flinch, his eyes were locked on Reid's with an intensity that could burn through steel. He had dealt with enough injustice in his life to know that standing down wasn't an option, not anymore. "Look at her," Derek shouted, pointing at Tasha. "Look at what you've done. She's a mother. She has a son who needs her. You can't just walk away from this. You can't." At the mention of her son, Officer Reid hesitated for the first time, his gaze flicking over to Jaden, who was still standing in the back seat of the car, his small body trembling as he cried out for his mother. His innocence, his confusion, was more than enough to make the officer pause, but it wasn't enough to make him lower the gun. "I warned you," Reid repeated, his voice becoming increasingly agitated. Suddenly, the sound of more sirens filled the air, growing louder and closer. Derek's grip tightened, his jaw clenched in frustration. This wasn't over. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the knowledge that everything could spiral out of control at any moment. Tasha's vision began to darken as the pain in her chest became unbearable. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Every movement she made was slower, weaker, until finally her body gave in, and she fell into unconsciousness. The world around her seemed to fade completely, but the echoes of Jaden's cries, the shouting, and the shrill wail of sirens pierced through the darkness. It was all too much. She was fighting a battle she might not survive, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. Tasha's world was a blur, a mix of flashing lights, voices shouting, and the sickening feeling of blood slowly soaking into her clothes. The pain had numbed, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache that she couldn't escape. She was still alive, barely, but each breath felt like a struggle. The thought of her son kept pushing her forward, pulling her back from the brink of unconsciousness, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could hang on. Derek was still shouting at Officer Reid, his anger boiling over, but the officer wasn't responding. Instead, he seemed frozen, caught in the same moment of indecision that had plagued him since he drew his weapon. The gun was still raised, but his posture had shifted. He wasn't as sure of himself now. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as more police cars arrived on the scene. The flashing blue and red lights bathed the highway in an eerie glow, casting long shadows over the chaotic scene. But rather than feeling safer, it only seemed to add to the tension. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and confusion. Some were recording, others whispering, but nobody dared to intervene. Derek wasn't about to let anyone stand in the way of justice. Not anymore. He pushed past the growing crowd, his eyes still locked on Officer Reid, his voice now laced with fury. "What are you waiting for, Reid? Are you going to shoot her again?" The officer's jaw clenched, his finger twitched, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might take another shot. But then, as if some unseen force had gripped him, Officer Reid hesitated. The realization was slowly sinking in. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He wasn't just dealing with a routine traffic stop anymore. He was in the midst of a public crisis, and the consequences of his actions would reach far beyond this moment. The sirens blared, and two more officers stepped out of the newly arrived police cars, their eyes darting between the crowd and Officer Reid. One of them, a younger woman with short curly hair, took a step forward. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Officer Reid's eyes flicked toward the new arrivals, his face red with frustration. "Nothing's going on, just handling a situation," he muttered. The woman didn't back down. She looked at the officer with a level of scrutiny that seemed to cut through the tension. "Is that so?" she asked, her gaze shifting to Derek, then to the blood-stained pavement where Tasha lay. "What exactly happened here?" Derek didn't wait for Officer Reid to answer. He stepped forward, his voice loud and clear, addressing both the new officer and the crowd. "This man shot her, point blank, for no reason at all. She was just driving with her son, minding her own business." The crowd gasped, the shock evident on their faces. Some were reaching for their phones, capturing the scene for the world to see. The younger officer's face darkened as she took in the situation, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Shot her," she repeated, her voice rising slightly in shock. "What the hell were you thinking, Reid?" Officer Reid opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was caught in his own web of lies, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. The younger officer stepped closer, her hands resting on her hips as she faced Reid. "You're not going to get away with this. Not this time." Tasha's world remained a swirling mess of noise and confusion, but through the haze she heard her son's voice again. Jaden. His cries were distant, but they pierced her heart, reminding her why she couldn't give up. She had to hold on. She had to survive for him. The younger officer turned to her partner, a man in his 40s with a shaved head, who had remained silent up until this point. He stepped forward, his eyes taking in the bloody scene before him. "We need to get her medical help now," he said, his voice firm. "She's not going to make it much longer if we don't." "Right," the younger officer replied, her hand reaching for her radio. "We need an ambulance now." As she radioed for help, Derek knelt beside Tasha, his hands gently lifting her head from the pavement. Her skin was cold, and the blood continued to seep from the wound in her chest. He could feel her pulse, but it was weak, fading with each passing second. He was running out of time. "Stay with me, Tasha," Derek muttered under his breath. He wasn't ready to lose her, not after everything they had fought for. I'm here," he repeated, trying to steady his own shaking hands. The image of her son, standing in the back of the car, screaming for his mother, replayed in his mind over and over again. This couldn't be the end, not like this. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. Tasha's breathing was shallow, her eyes unfocused. She was slipping away, and no amount of encouragement or words could change that. The younger officer knelt beside him, her voice softening for the first time. "We're going to help her. The ambulance is on the way. Just hang on." Derek didn't respond. His focus was entirely on Tasha. He gently pressed his hand to her chest, his eyes searching for any sign of strength in her. He couldn't lose her, not like this. Meanwhile, Officer Reid had stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the gravity of what he had done. His colleagues were no longer on his side. The younger officer's actions had drawn a clear line in the sand, and now there was nowhere for him to hide. The sirens grew louder, and within moments an ambulance screeched to a halt, the paramedics rushing toward the scene with the urgency of professionals who had seen too much but never enough. The younger officer turned to Derek. "We need to clear the area, let them work." Derek hesitated, his gaze never leaving Tasha. But as the paramedics started working on her, trying to stabilize her, he stepped back reluctantly. He needed answers, but he knew the first priority was getting Tasha the help she needed. "Don't worry," the younger officer added, her voice steady. "We'll make sure this gets investigated. We won't let him get away with this." As the paramedics loaded Tasha into the ambulance, the younger officer turned back to the crowd, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The ambulance doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo in Derek's chest. He stood motionless, watching as the paramedics rushed to the vehicle, sirens blaring as they sped away to the nearest hospital. The sound of the sirens was fading in the distance, but it was like a constant hum in his ears. He couldn't shake the image of Tasha lying on the pavement, her life slipping away with every breath she barely managed to take. He was still trying to process everything that had just happened. It felt surreal, like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Officer Reid, the man responsible for this nightmare, stood nearby, his back stiff and his eyes darting nervously between the growing crowd and his fellow officers. He hadn't spoken a word since Tasha was taken away, but it was clear to Derek that Reid was desperately trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. The younger officer, whose actions had saved Tasha's life for the time being, was already speaking with the arriving investigators, taking notes and providing a clear account of what had happened. Derek could feel the anger building inside him again. This wasn't just about Tasha. This was about every black mother, father, son, and daughter who had been victimized by a system that seemed to protect its own, no matter how corrupt. This wasn't a random incident. It was part of something much bigger, something that had been happening for far too long. He turned toward the crowd that had gathered. The people who had witnessed everything were still standing by, some talking amongst themselves, others silently watching. Derek's eyes fell on a young woman who had been filming the entire encounter on her phone. She had captured the exact moment Officer Reid had pulled the trigger, the panic in Tasha's eyes, and the horror of the situation. The woman was staring at her phone, her face pale as the video replayed over and over again. Derek could see the fear in her expression, but also the sense of urgency. She was well aware of what she had just captured, a smoking gun in the fight for justice. "Hey," Derek called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Can I see that video?" The young woman turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Derek's. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, walking toward him with the phone in her outstretched hand. "I can't believe I caught all of that," she said, her voice trembling. I was just doing what I always do, recording things. But when I saw him pull that gun," she trailed off, her words heavy with the weight of the moment. Derek took the phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he held it in front of him. The video played, and the image of Tasha's sudden fall to the ground, the shot that tore through her body, played out in brutal detail. Derek could hear Jaden's cries in the background, the sound of his innocent voice pleading for his mother, as the officer's cold words echoed in the distance. "You don't belong here." The video ended abruptly as the officer turned away, retreating from the scene, leaving Derek with a growing fire inside him. This video was everything. It was undeniable proof of what had happened. But he knew it wasn't going to be enough. He couldn't rely solely on this one piece of evidence. Officer Reid was a part of a system that would fight to protect him, to sweep his actions under the rug. This was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. "Thank you," Derek said, his voice steady as he handed the phone back to the woman. "This is going to make all the difference." She nodded, her face filled with determination. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." Derek turned away, his focus now on Officer Reid. The officer had tried to blend in with the other officers, pretending as if nothing had happened, but Derek could see the guilt written all over his face. Reid was trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear that his sense of authority had crumbled. He knew the walls were closing in, and it wasn't just because of Tasha. Derek approached him slowly, his voice low and cold. "You'll pay for this, Reid. You think you can get away with it, but you won't." Reid's eyes flickered nervously, but he said nothing in return. He turned his back on Derek, but Derek wasn't about to let him walk away. "No, no, no. You're not walking away from this," Derek said, grabbing Reid by the shoulder, spinning him back around to face him. "You've hurt someone, and you'll answer for it." The younger officer who had intervened earlier stepped forward at that moment, placing a hand on Derek's arm. "Let him go. We're taking this to the authorities now," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "The investigation is already in motion. We'll make sure he's held accountable." Derek looked at her for a moment, his anger still simmering, but he knew she was right. This wasn't the time for physical confrontation. The real fight was going to be in the courts, in the town meetings, in every single step they took to hold Officer Reid and the system that allowed him to act with impunity accountable. Tasha's life was on the line, and it wasn't just her life they were fighting for. It was for every person who had ever been treated like they didn't matter, like they were invisible. Today was the day they were going to make sure that would change. As the scene unfolded around him, Derek felt a strange sense of clarity. The battle was just beginning, but they had the truth on their side, and the truth would always win. The days that followed were a whirlwind of news coverage, protests, and meetings with lawyers. Tasha, still fighting for her life, had been stabilized at the hospital, though her condition was critical. Her doctors said it was touch and go, but Derek didn't have time to wait. He couldn't let the story die in the shadows. The world needed to see what Officer Reid had done, and the system needed to be held accountable. Derek stayed by Tasha's side as much as possible, but he knew that the battle wasn't just in the hospital room. He had to take the fight to the people, to the community, to those who had stayed silent for far too long. The video, the one the young woman had filmed, had gone viral almost immediately. The raw footage of Tasha's brutal shooting, the moment Reid pulled the trigger, the screams of her son, it was all out there for the world to see, and the world was watching. The local protests had begun almost immediately after the video went public. People were angry, upset, and demanding justice. What had started as one officer's recklessness had sparked a fire that couldn't be contained. Signs with the words "Justice for Tasha" and "End Police Brutality" filled the streets. People from all walks of life were coming together to demand change, to stand against a system that had been broken for too long. Derek knew it was only the beginning, but it was a start. By the time the local news stations were covering the protests, the pressure on the police department was overwhelming. The chief of police had issued a statement, claiming that the department was conducting a thorough investigation, but the words rang hollow. Derek knew better. This wasn't going to be solved with empty promises. It was going to take more than just apologies. It was going to take real, tangible consequences. At the hospital, Tasha had finally regained consciousness, but her body was still frail, weak. She couldn't speak much yet, but when Derek walked into her room, he saw the glimmer of recognition in her eyes. Her lips parted as if trying to say something, but no words came out. "Tasha," Derek said softly, sitting beside her bed, "we're going to make this right. I'm not going to let them get away with this. You hear me?" Tasha's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment she tried to smile, though it was weak. Derek took her hand gently, careful not to hurt her. He was going to fight for her, for Jaden, for all of them. The fight had just begun, and he wasn't going to stop until he had justice in his hands. Meanwhile, the pressure on Officer Reid was mounting. He was placed on administrative leave, but it was clear that was just a temporary measure. The media had begun to dig into his history, and what they found was a pattern of aggressive behavior, complaints filed by other citizens, and reports that had never been properly investigated. It didn't take long for the truth to unravel. Reid had a history, one that had been ignored. He had a record of discriminatory behavior that had been swept under the rug for years, and now it was all coming to light. But the town wasn't going to let it go that easily. At a rally outside the police department, Derek stood in front of a crowd of hundreds. The signs were still held high, the chants still loud and unrelenting. The streets were filled with people who had finally had enough. And standing on the stage, Derek spoke with a voice that carried through the crowd, strong and unyielding. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that has failed us for too long. It's about every single person who has been targeted, harassed, and made to feel less than. We are not going to stay silent anymore." The crowd roared, their voices merging into one unified force. The energy was electric, the momentum building with every passing second. Derek wasn't just speaking for Tasha anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been victimized, everyone who had suffered in silence. As the rally continued, news of Tasha's recovery spread. People were waiting for her to speak, to share her story. But even though she wasn't able to speak publicly yet, her story was already having an impact. Her strength, her fight, was what was driving this movement forward. She wasn't just a victim, she was a symbol of the change they were all fighting for. The police department could no longer hide behind empty statements. The pressure was too much. A week after the rally, the district attorney's office announced they were pursuing criminal charges against Officer Reid for excessive use of force and assault with a deadly weapon. The news hit like a thunderclap, reverberating through the town and across the country. It wasn't just the charges against Reid, it was the start of a real conversation about police reform, accountability, and justice. But it wasn't just Reid who would face the consequences. The town was demanding answers from everyone involved. The police chief, the city officials, no one was going to be spared. The truth had been exposed, and the community wasn't backing down. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Officer Reid deepened. More witnesses came forward, more stories were told. The district attorney's office had the evidence they needed, and they were pushing for a trial. Reid would face a jury of his peers, and he would be held accountable for his actions. As the trial date approached, the atmosphere in the town was one of cautious hope. People were hopeful that justice would finally be served, but Derek knew that the road ahead was still long. This was just one battle in a much larger war for equality, fairness, and accountability. The fight wasn't over. Tasha was slowly recovering, her strength returning little by little. She was surrounded by her family, her friends, and her community, all of whom were rallying around her. Jaden, still young but resilient, stayed close by her side, his presence a constant reminder of why they were all fighting so hard. In the end, Tasha's story wasn't just about what happened to her on that highway. It was about the change that came after. It was about the courage to stand up, to fight back, and to demand justice, no matter how powerful the forces against them were. And as the trial date loomed closer, the town stood united. They were no longer silent. They were no longer afraid. They had witnessed the consequences of injustice, and they were ready to fight for a future where things would be different.